For 10 years, Milo healed people without saying a word, veterans who couldn't sleep, children who wouldn't speak. But when his body gave out and his owner died, he was left in a cage like he'd never mattered. No tail wag, no goodbye, just silence. Until one morning someone saw him, not for what he was, but for who he had been. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. Evergreen Falls, Oregon, late November. A crisp wind pushed through the pines, bringing with it the smell of rain and a chill that clung to every surface like a warning of the winter to come. The Evergreen Haven Animal Shelter sat on the outskirts of town, nestled between towering fir trees and fields, already kissed by frost. Its roof, patched and rust-colored, gave away its age, and the draft slipping through the narrow halls seemed to carry more than just cold air. It carried silence, heavy and waiting. Inside, the metallic scent of disinfectant mixed with the sharp bite of wet fur. Dogs barked, some in excitement, others in desperation. But in the farthest corner of the kennel behind bars and shadow there was no sound. His name was Milo. Milo was a 10-year-old golden retriever, though age had nearly erased the memory of that golden hue. His once lustrous coat had faded to a dull cream with patches of silver and thinning fur along his flanks. His eyes, once bright with warmth, were now fogged with age like twilight that never turned to night, but never again saw daylight. His frame, large but sunken, trembled whenever he tried to stand, and often he didn't. He simply lay there, curled tightly against the corner as if trying to vanish into it. Milo hadn't eaten properly in weeks. He barely moved. He did not bark or growl or wag his tail. Most volunteers assumed he had simply stopped, not died, but given up on living. "Hasn't lifted his head in 3 days," murmured Angela, a college-aged volunteer with freckles and a nervous sort of kindness. She wore oversized sweaters and always smelled faintly of chamomile tea. "We've tried soft food, warm blankets, music. He just waits. Waits for what someone had asked once." No one answered. That morning, the shelter door creaked open against the wind, and in stepped Claire Whitmore. Claire was in her early 50s, tall and slender with the kind of posture that came from decades of standing in front of classrooms. Her hair, once auburn, now carried streaks of silver that caught the light like threads of wisdom. She wore a long wool coat the color of slate, and her eyes, gray, quiet. Observant had the tired look of someone who had once been bright, but had since learned the art of dimming. She hadn't planned on coming. In fact, she had avoided the shelter for over a year, ever since her husband David passed away from a sudden stroke on a warm August morning. They had been married for 27 years. She had worn his flannel that week like armor, and then slowly she stopped wearing color altogether. Claire was a high school literature teacher known by her students for her dry wit and a patience that bordered on saintly. But those who knew her well, few and scattered, had noticed the quiet in her lately, a kind of unraveling silence. So when she walked into Evergreen Haven that morning, she did so with no intention of adopting anything. It was simply a distraction from the too-empty house and the stack of ungraded essays waiting on her kitchen table. She wandered past kennels filled with yapping puppies, excitable hounds, and barking shepherds. Each tail wagged, each pair of eyes begged. But Claire didn't stop. She kept walking until the barking faded and the hallway turned quiet. And then she saw him. Milo lay in the last kennel on the left beneath a flickering light bulb and beside a rusted mop bucket. He didn't move. He didn't even look up. Claire's breath caught, not from shock, but from recognition. She had seen that same look in the mirror not long ago. Stillness, not from peace, but from fatigue, from the ache of holding on too long. "Who's that?" she asked, her voice barely louder than the wind outside. Angela turned. Oh, that's Milo. He's old, 10-year-old. Came in a few months ago after his owner passed. Family didn't want him. Claire blinked. 10-year-old. Yeah. We think he used to be a therapy dog. Worked with PTSD patients, maybe children too, but no one really knows for sure. Claire stepped closer. Milo still didn't move. What happened to him? She asked quietly. Angela hesitated. After his owner died, the son dropped him off. Said he couldn't take care of a dog that just lays around and stinks like sadness. His words. Claire said nothing. She simply stared. Milo's ribs rose and fell in shallow, deliberate rhythm. His ears, scarred and slow to react, twitched once when she knelt by the bars. But he did not look at her. Does he respond to anyone? She asked. Angela shook her head. He's like a ghost. And somehow that made Claire stay longer. Back at home, Claire had been preparing for the arrival of her 12-year-old nephew Evan, who would be staying with her for the winter break. Evan was on the autism spectrum, a quiet boy with sandy brown hair, pale skin, and a fragile way of walking like the world was too loud beneath his feet. His parents had divorced last summer, and since then Evan had stopped speaking entirely. Not out of rebellion, but as if language had stopped working the way it used to. Claire didn't know how to reach him, but she knew silence. She knew what it meant to fold into the background and let grief speak in your place. Now, staring at the broken shell of a dog in the coldest corner of the shelter, Claire felt something she hadn't in months: connection. Milo wasn't barking, wasn't begging. He was simply existing. And maybe that was enough. She rose, brushed off her coat, and looked once more through the bars. "I'm not here to save you," she murmured. "But I think maybe we need each other." Milo didn't stir, but Claire didn't walk away either. It was the kind of morning that seemed to hold its breath. The sky in Evergreen Falls hung low, with heavy clouds casting a dull silver light over the sleepy town. The frost had not yet melted from the eaves of rooftops, and the pines stood still in the silence that came before the snow. Claire Whitmore pulled her coat tighter around her frame as she stood outside Evergreen Haven, staring up at the crooked, open sign hanging in the fogged glass door. She hadn't meant to come back, and yet something about those eyes, those soft-weathered and endlessly tired eyes, had followed her home last night. She had seen sorrow before. She had lived it, but not like this. Not so silent, not so still. Inside the shelter smelled of bleach and wet fur. Claire passed rows of barking dogs, their bodies wagging, spinning some pawing at the cage doors with desperate hope. She walked past them all until she reached the farthest corner of the hallway. The noise seemed to dull here, as though grief itself had swallowed the sound. There he was. Milo lay exactly where she'd left him. His golden coat, dulled with age, now more ivory than honey, curled tight against the concrete wall. He didn't move. But his eyes were open, and they watched her with a depth that unsettled her more than any bark could have. Angela, the young volunteer with freckled cheeks and a soft, earnest way of speaking, appeared beside her, clipboard in hand. "He doesn't react to much," Angela said gently, kneeling beside her. "But you're right about the eyes. There's something in them. We think he was a therapy dog once." Claire looked up. "How do you know?" Angela pointed to the small scar under Milo's right ear. "Microchip. Old registry flagged him as an emotional support animal. No specifics, though. Just that he worked with a private clinic. That was years ago." Claire turned back to the dog, and now Angela hesitated. "He hasn't eaten in days. Doesn't respond to other animals. Barely notices us when we clean his cage. To be honest, we're not sure if he'll make it through winter." Claire swallowed. "What happens if he doesn't get adopted?" Angela didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence was answer enough. Claire reached out her fingers, resting just outside the bars. Has anyone tried? Angela shook her head. People want dogs that wag their tails, that play fetch, not ones who don't move. Claire looked into Milo's eyes again. They held no light, no recognition, but they were not empty. I'll take him, she said softly. Angela blinked. You. What, I'll bring him home. Claire repeated, her voice firmer now. At least let him have a bed, a fire, a name. He has a name. Claire nodded slowly. Then let him remember it in a place with warmth. Angela hesitated. We'll need to fill out some paperwork. He might not last long, then he won't die in a cage. That afternoon, Claire carried Milo inside her small cottage at the edge of town. The fireplace was already lit, crackling gently, casting amber light over the wooden floorboards. A bed had been laid out, an old one from her late husband's reading nook, lined with a thick quilt. Milo didn't resist as she set him down. His body sagged into the bedding like a sigh. Claire knelt beside him, brushing her hand through the matted fur behind his ear. You're home, now, she whispered. There was no wag, no whimper, but his eyes followed her when she stood. By nightfall, the wind had picked up. It whistled through the trees like voices from another world, and under that wind another presence arrived. The taxi pulled up quietly in front of the house. Claire stepped out onto the porch as the driver unloaded a small suitcase. Evan stood beside the car, bundled in a blue parka, too large for his thin shoulders. He was 12, pale and slight, with light brown hair that curled at the ends and wide hazel eyes that never quite looked at you. He wore a pair of large noise-canceling headphones, and his expression, blank and unreadable, hadn't changed since the moment the custody handoff began. He didn't say a word. Claire smiled gently, kneeling so her eyes were level with his. Hi, sweetheart. No response. He clutched his sketch pad to his chest. Claire thanked the driver and led Evan inside. He paused in the doorway, eyes scanning the room. When he saw Milo curled by the fireplace, he tilted his head slightly but made no sound. Claire gently took his coat and pointed toward the guest room. Your room's down that hall. Take your time. Evan walked slowly. He didn't look at Claire, didn't touch anything. He disappeared into the shadows of the hallway like a ghost with unfinished business. That night, Claire sat on the couch, her legs tucked under her, a book open on her lap she wasn't reading. She glanced between the dog and the closed door at the end of the hall. Two souls in silence. One used to bark, the other used to laugh. Now, neither of them spoke. She looked at Milo, who lay unmoving but awake, his eyes following the firelight as though remembering what it once meant to feel warmth. Maybe, she whispered to herself, you're exactly what we need. It had been 4 days since Milo came home. 4 days of shallow breaths, untouched meals, and days strung together with threadbare hope. Outside, the world of evergreen falls shifted slowly into winter ice, laced the tree branches, and the snow settled like dust on windowsills. Inside Claire Whitmore's cottage, the only sounds were the quiet crackle of the fire and the occasional creak of old wood. Even the air felt hesitant. Claire woke early, as she had every morning since Milo arrived, her robe pulled tight, and the scent of coffee grounding her as she moved through the silent kitchen. Before she touched her mug, she knelt beside Milo's bed near the fireplace. His chest moved faintly, a sign of life more precious than any word. His golden coat was thinner now, paling with age, and his bones pressed gently against his skin like quiet confessions. He still wouldn't eat. Claire had tried warm broth, shredded turkey, even a bit of bacon. Nothing stirred his appetite. He'd only lift his eyes to follow her, cloudy but aware, as though he were watching not her hands, but her intention. Upstairs, Evan's presence lingered like a ghost, real but always just out of reach. He spent most of his time in the guest room, sketchpad, always in hand noise, canceling headphones firmly over his ears. He didn't speak. He didn't look Claire in the eyes, but he ate the meal she left outside his door. She took that as a beginning. On the fifth night, Claire sat reading on the couch, her book forgotten in her lap. The house was still. Milo lay by the fire, his form unmoving, but his eyes open. He hadn't slept deeply since his arrival. Even in stillness, his ears twitched at the faintest sound. The quiet broke with the soft crash of glass. Claire turned just in time to see Evan standing in the hallway, a framed photo now shattered at his feet. His small frame was wrapped in an oversized sweatshirt pajama pants trailing the ground. His hazel eyes were wide, unreadable. He didn't cry or move. He simply stared at the broken image on the floor, a family photo old and sun-faded of Claire David, and a young Evan caught in a rare moment of laughter under summer light. Before Claire could speak, Milo moved. The old retriever, slow and trembling, pushed himself upright with visible effort. His joints cracked softly as he rose, and he took one unsteady step forward, then another, until he reached Evan. Then, with a sigh, like the settling of time itself, Milo laid his head gently against the boy's shin. Evan didn't flinch. He didn't retreat. His shoulders softened almost imperceptibly. His hand, once clenched around his sketch pad, relaxed. Claire didn't breathe. Evan looked down the corner of his mouth, twitching, not a smile, not a frown, just a shift, a ripple. He knelt slowly, gently beside Milo. They stayed that way for a long time. No words, no explanation. Just the warmth of shared silence. The next morning, Claire found Evan at the kitchen table. It was the first time he'd come down without prompting. He sat hunched over his sketchpad, pencil in hand, his movements careful and exact. She didn't speak as she approached. The drawing revealed itself. Slowly, Milo curled beneath the sprawling limbs of a tree. Sunlight dappled across his back. Beside him, a boy, cross-legged, headphones still in place, sat close. They weren't touching, but the closeness was clear. Two figures bound not by motion, but by presence. Claire's heart twisted. She sat down across from him and whispered, "That's beautiful." Evan didn't answer, but he didn't close the sketchpad either. That afternoon, Claire added an extra blanket to Milo's bed and moved his water bowl closer. She played soft piano music, something gentle and wordless. Milo stirred his tail, twitching once. Claire smiled through the tears that stung her eyes. That night, she passed by Evan's room and saw the sketch he'd taped to his door, not the one she'd seen earlier. A new one. It was Milo again. But this time, the tree's branches had names carved into them. One said Claire, another said Evan, and just above Milo's head, faint and faded, the name David. Claire pressed her hand to the wall for support. She didn't knock, didn't disturb him, just let the moment be. The frost had thickened by morning, laying a brittle crust across every surface in Evergreen Falls. The sun barely rose above the treetops, casting a soft amber light that did little to melt the cold. Inside the cottage, however, something had begun to thaw. Claire noticed it in the way Evan sat closer to the fire, now his sketchpad resting beside him instead of clutched like a shield. Milo, still frail, had taken to resting with his chin on Evan's foot whenever the boy sat still long enough. Claire had been quiet too, but not idle. For the past 2 days she had been making calls. She had gone through the old adoption paperwork from the shelter, scanning for any trail that might lead to Milo's past. A scribbled note in the margin of a file caught her attention. Registered therapy program, Cascade Wellness Institute. A name, half-faded, Dr. H. Dixon. It took some digging, but eventually she found a phone number and then an address. The man had retired 3 years ago, lived alone now, just outside Redmond, Oregon, 3 hours from Evergreen Falls. Claire didn't hesitate. That Friday morning she left Evan with the neighbor Mrs. Landry, an elderly widow who ran a small crafting workshop from her home. She was a kind woman with snowy hair and warm lavender-scented sweaters. Evan had visited once before to drop off cookies and hadn't resisted when Claire suggested he stay there for the afternoon. Mrs. Landry had a cat named Chester, fat and orange, who snored louder than most people talked. Evan didn't smile, but he didn't retreat either. Claire took that as permission. She drove east through winding roads, her hands gripping the wheel tighter than usual. The sky was pale and clear, the evergreens standing silent like sentinels on either side. When she pulled into the long gravel driveway of the house, she saw it immediately, a modest 2-story cabin with a wraparound porch and a wind chime that sang softly in the wind. There was something sturdy about it, something like trust. She knocked only once. The man who opened the door was tall, well into his 70s, with a full white beard and deep lines carved into his face from years of listening more than speaking. He wore a navy cardigan with leather elbow patches and thick corduroy pants. His eyes, sharp and pale blue, studied her without fear. Dr. Dixon, Claire asked. "Yes?" he replied, voice gravelly but calm. "You must be the one who called about Milo." Claire nodded. "I brought him home last week, from the shelter." The doctor's mouth twitched into something between a smile and a grimace. "They told me he was euthanized 2 months ago." "He wasn't," Claire said quietly. "But he came close." Dr. Dixon stepped aside and motioned her in. The house smelled of cedarwood and old paper. Books lined every wall, and a record player sat in the corner spinning something soft and orchestral. A fire burned low in a stone hearth. "I wasn't Milo's owner," he said, lowering himself into a leather armchair, "but he was family." Claire sat across from him, clasping her hands. "I'm trying to understand who he was." Dr. Dixon nodded, staring into the fire for a moment. He was donated to the Institute when he was barely a year old. A failed hunting dog, too gentle, too slow. But he had something else. He listened. Claire tilted her head. "Listened to silence," the doctor said. "He had this way of being still with people. Patients would come in, veterans with PTSD, children with developmental challenges, some who hadn't spoken in months, and Milo would just sit. Not demand, not entertain, just sit. And something about that made people want to speak." Claire swallowed. "So, he wasn't trained, he was shaped. Therapy isn't obedience, it's presence. Milo had that in abundance." She hesitated. "Did he ever work remotely, with children?" Dr. Dixon blinked slowly, then leaned forward. "There was a boy, 6 years ago, lived in Portland. Couldn't attend in-person sessions, so we started video sessions with Milo. Just the dog in the frame, no talking. The boy didn't speak either at first." Claire's breath hitched. What was the boy's name? The doctor frowned, thinking. "Evan." "I remember because his mother sent a letter 6 months later. Said he had spoken for the first time after watching Milo lay down during a session." Claire stared at him, stunned into stillness. "I'm his aunt," she said finally. "He's living with me now." Dr. Dixon leaned back slowly, the lines around his eyes deepening. "Then perhaps fate has a stranger hand than we think." Claire didn't speak. She didn't trust her voice. Dr. Dixon stood and walked to a shelf, pulling down an old folder from a wooden box. This was Milo's early record. "Nothing sensitive. You can take it." She accepted it with trembling hands. Before she left, the doctor placed a hand on her shoulder. "He's not just a dog, Miss Whitmore. He's a bridge. sometimes between people, sometimes between what was and what still could be. Claire nodded, eyes wet. Thank you. The drive home blurred. She didn't play music. She didn't stop for coffee. She drove with one hand on the steering wheel and the other holding the file across her lap like something sacred. When she reached Evergreen Falls, the snow had returned, soft swirling flakes dancing in the headlights. Claire picked Evan up from Mrs. Landry's just after dark. He didn't say anything, but when she opened the back door of the car, he got in without prompting. He held a tiny felt cat in his hand, something he must have made with her that day. Back at home, the fire was still burning. Milo lay curled in the same place by the hearth. But now he was not alone. Evan had taken his blanket and laid it down beside Milo's bed. The boy was already asleep, his small body curled gently toward the dogs, the space between them barely enough for air. Claire stood in the doorway, the folders still in her arms. For the first time in months, her heart was not heavy. It was full. The snow had fallen in silence overnight, thick and undisturbed like the hush of a cathedral. Outside, the world had turned white rooftops, softened trees bowed gently under the weight, and the roads of Evergreen Falls disappeared beneath a smooth, untouched blanket. The sky was a soft pearl gray, and the air smelled of winter's breath. Inside Claire Whitmore's cottage, the warmth of the fire reached into every corner. The logs had burned down to glowing embers, and the ticking of the old clock on the mantel was the only sound breaking the stillness. Claire stirred awake to the scent of pinewood smoke and something else movement. She blinked and sat up slowly on the couch where she had fallen asleep with a book open across her lap. Her gaze drifted instinctively to Milo's bed near the fire. But Milo wasn't there. She froze. Then she saw him standing by the front door. The old golden retriever, 10-year-old and frail, stood on trembling legs, his spine hunched slightly but his head lifted, and his tail, it moved. Not wildly, just a slow, deliberate wag like a whisper of joy after a lifetime of waiting. Claire pressed a hand to her chest, stunned. Milo turned his head slightly, his cloudy eyes locking with hers. Not vacant, not lost. Present. "Good morning," she whispered. He stepped forward once the motion, stiff but determined. Claire hurried over and opened the door, letting in a sliver of cold light. Milo didn't bolt. He didn't hesitate. He simply stood there for a long moment, breathing in the snow-drenched air, his tail still gently wagging, and then behind her a soft sound, paper moving, pencil scratching. Evan sat at the kitchen table, bathed in the soft morning glow. He was still in his pajamas, his hair uncombed, the sleeves of his hoodie bunched around his wrists, but there was something different about his posture. His shoulders relaxed, his mouth curved upward just slightly. He was smiling. Claire moved quietly behind him, not wanting to disrupt the moment. She glanced down at the paper in front of him and felt her breath catch. The drawing was simple but full of heart. 3 figures sat together beneath the limbs of a large tree, a woman, a boy, and a dog with soft golden fur. They weren't just sitting, they were touching, leaning into one another. There was warmth in the lines and the soft shadows beneath them. At the bottom, in careful, deliberate lettering, Evan had written, "This is home." Claire knelt slowly beside him, her eyes stinging. "Did you draw this for me?" Evan nodded once, not looking up. Claire smiled, a quiet, aching smile that came from somewhere long untouched. She reached out and touched his hand gently. He didn't pull away. Behind them, Milo turned and slowly made his way to the table. He paused beside Evan, lowered himself to the ground with effort, and rested his head on the boy's foot. Evan looked down, and then, for the first time since arriving, he spoke. His voice was soft, hoarse, barely above a breath. But it was clear. "Good boy." Claire's hands trembled. She closed her eyes. Milo blinked, the tail still wagging. and let out a low sound somewhere between a huff and a sigh, as if he'd been holding it in for far too long. The day passed in quiet peace. Claire made pancakes. Evan helped stir the batter, his hands covered in flour. His lips curled in the faintest of smiles. Milo followed them slowly from room to room, pausing to lie wherever they settled near the table beside the couch under the window seat where Evan sat sketching the snow outside. That evening, as the wind picked up and dusk painted the snow with lavender and gold, they sat by the fire once more. Claire curled up in her chair with a blanket over her lap. Evan sat on the floor beside her, still sketching. And Milo, old and fading but no longer lost, lay curled beside Evan, his head resting gently on the boy's leg. No one spoke. No one needed to. The warmth between them spoke louder than words, and for the first time in a very long time, none of them felt forgotten. Sometimes the quietest miracles are the ones that change us the most. Not the thunderous moments, but the small sacred ones. A wagging tail, a whispered word, a boy's smile after years of silence. Milo wasn't just a dog. He was a reminder that no life is ever too old, too broken, or too forgotten for grace. In a world that often moves too fast to notice the hurting, it is often the most wounded among us who carry healing in their presence. And maybe that kind of healing doesn't come from medicine or logic. Maybe it comes from something deeper. A divine whisper. A nudge from God. A second chance we didn't expect, but so deeply needed. So today, if you're carrying grief, loneliness, or loss, remember Milo. Remember that love still finds its way home, that healing can come from the most unlikely places, and that God still works through silent pause and broken hearts. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to comment Amen below, as a prayer for every soul, human or animal, still waiting to be seen, to be held, to be loved. Share this story with someone who needs hope today. Comment your thoughts. We read every one. Subscribe to the channel for more true stories of redemption and grace. May God bless you and all those you love.